Hi everyone, thanks for coming today. We're just going to wait another couple of minutes and just let everyone come through, and we'll see shortly. Okay, just let the rest of them trickle through, but welcome to MLA's Cattle Projections webinar for 2024. Today we'll be discussing the September update, which was released earlier this week. We would like to thank you for taking the time to attend today. My name's Angus Murray, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. The team presenting is Erin Lukey, MLA's Senior Market Information Analyst, Emily Tan, Market Information Analyst, and Tim Jackson, the team's Global Supply Analyst. We'll pass on to the team now to get a quick introduction before the presentation. Erin, would you like to start us off?
Sure. My name is Erin Lukey. As Gus mentioned, I'm MLA Senior Market Information Analyst. I've been with MLA for just about 12 months now, so went through the previous projections process. So as a market information team, we provide an industry insights using data from the National Livestock Reporting Service, which is through our sale yards, and also a bunch of other data sources. We produce these projections reports, as well as state of the industry documents, industry surveys, feedlot brief, co-products pricing reports, and a bunch of other information, and always do ad hoc requests. And I'll pass over to Em.
Hi, so my name is Emily. I'm the Market Information Analyst. I've also been here for about a year now with Erin. So I look after everything regarding domestic supply for everything up until the processor. I, in particular, look after the beef producers intention survey, and Erin looks after the sheep producers intention survey. I'll pass on to Tim.
Hi, My name's Tim Jackson. I'm the Global Supply Analyst in the Market Information team. So I look at what's happening in other countries overseas in terms of production and pricing, and then and analyze what happens and what that means for demand for Australian red meat. I also look after our export data and publish the global the global beef market update, the first of which came out about a month ago. So now I'll just hand back to Angus.
Very nice. The team's contact details will be made available at the end of the webinar. If you have any supply, price, or production related inquiries, please reach out. We're happy to assist. Before we start off today, I'll just cover a few housekeeping points regarding today's presentation. All participants will be on mute throughout the presentation, and make sure your cameras are off before we start. There will be an allocated time for questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions anytime by scanning the QR code on each of the slides, which will take you to our Slido platform. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be uploaded onto MLA's website and to YouTube if you wish to reshare or watch it a little bit later. If you have not obtained a copy of MLA's September cattle projections, you can source it by going to MLA's website under the Trends and Analysis page, or again, feel free to reach out using the contact details at the end of the presentation. We'll now begin the webinar. Today, Erin, Emily, and Tim will cover sections of the cattle projections document in detail. Erin will start with an overview of the updated document headlines. Then, together with Emily, they will discuss domestic insights that will impact the herd and production, as well as our industry forecast for 2026. And finishing off, Tim will provide insights into the global environment and growing export opportunities. A reminder that there will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the presentation. Just use the little QR code on each of the slides. Then at the end of the webinar, the team will provide responses. Today, to kick us off, Erin, what are the key takeaways from the cattle projections update?
Thanks, Gus. So our updated projections are relatively similar to the March release, with all areas following similar trend changes to our original forecasts. We've had some adjustments to the historical herd figures in line with new ABS data, and Em will cover that later on in the presentation. So our 4 key summary points from the document are that the herd is estimated to have eased slightly from 2023 to June 2024. And our new herd figure is 30.2 million head. Slaughter is forecast to lift 16% this year, tipping 8 million head by the end of the year. Production will increase with this to near records by the end of this year, and then will surpass and reach new records in 2025. And then finally, analysts have forecast prices to remain relatively stable towards December.
Beautiful. We know weather plays a critical role in influencing the national cattle herd. Could you give us an overview of how recent weather has impacted the industry?
Yeah, so weather is definitely the main impact on our herd size and production forecasts. In the first 6 months of 2024, we've seen conditions varied across the country. And then we've seen the climate shift from a declared El Nino in 2023 to now neutral conditions. When we look at the northern cattle producing regions, we've had several consistent wet seasons which have supported a stable northern herd. And then when you look to southern Australia, they've experienced a positive summer followed by deteriorating conditions, drying out over autumn through winter, which has led to much higher turnoff in the southern regions.
Thanks, Erin. You mentioned the historic trends, but what is the current outlook for the projections period out to 2026?
So current weather patterns have differed from historical patterns, leading to uncertainty over our forecast period. We're operating in an environment that is really quite different to our seasonal trends. The 3-month rainfall forecast out to November, as you can see on the right, is for our eastern states to see average to above average rainfall, along with southwest WA. Rainfall is expected to be low across central WA, and these regions are unlikely to exceed their median rainfall over spring. Beyond that, for the purpose of these projections, MLA have made the assumption that the next 2 years will be average to average dry seasons.
Rainfall is such a big topic of discussion, but what other metrics does the team use to determine the success of the upcoming season?
Yeah, so we know rainfall doesn't always equate to valuable pasture growth. Instead, we can look to soil moisture to give us an understanding of the base the region is working from. This chart, it covers year-to-date root zone soil moisture, and we can see the impacts of the dry conditions across southern Australia. So over some parts of South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania are experiencing some of the worst soil moisture on record in that lowest 1% bracket. We've heard a lot of chatter around a green drought, which means that short-term rainfall has caused growth, though this below average soil moisture has impacted the value and longevity of the feed. When you look to the north, the opposite can be seen, especially across the Territory and the Gulf region of Queensland, where soil moisture has been very much above averages, and in some areas it's the highest 1% on record. So this chart really reflects the varied nature of our national climate and then the different production systems that the northern and southern herds are operating under.
Thanks, Aaron. Moving now on to the macroeconomic issues highlighted in the report. Emily, the document provides an overview of the current financial environment impacting cattle production in Australia. Starting with interest rates and inflation, would you be able to walk us through the financial headlines?
Absolutely. In projections document, we look at the current inflation rate and interest rates. Firstly, the RBA interest rate has remained at 4.35% for the past 6 months. This is the highest it's been in over a decade. Looking ahead, the big four banks are expecting cuts to start at the end of 2024 or early next year. Moving on to the current inflation rate, in July, inflation was reported at 3.5%, easing slightly from June. This remains above the target inflation rate of 2 to 3%. Elevated inflation will continue to put pressure on industry, driving up costs and impacting business decision making.
So you mentioned the impact of inflation and interest rates. What about our current exchange rate? How does this affect the supply chain?
The current exchange rate between the Australian dollar and the US dollar remains at $1.53. This has had an impact on making exports cheaper and increasing the price of imports. This weakening of the Australian dollar has subsequently increased the competitiveness of Australian beef overseas, driven by the demand from the US and North Asian markets.
So over the past several months, you've spoken to industry representatives across the red meat supply chain to get a sense of what issues were affecting them. During this consultation process, what key cost pressures have been identified?
So input costs are rapidly increasing, putting producers in more and more of a difficult financial position. Council rates are also a growing cost for small business owners and were identified as the fastest growing operating costs during our consultations. Fuel and electricity continue to put pressure on operating costs. According to the ABS, electricity costs have increased by 4% compared to the beginning of the year. Diesel prices across August are 12% below this time last year, although remain a significant cost up and down the supply chain. Elevated fuel prices are expected to continue to impact beef production through higher transport and operational costs.
Okay. We've also observed that labour availability and employment have been a consistent concern for processors over the last couple of years. Will this impact beef supply for the projections period?
So there's been a stable lift in cattle slaughter in the last year, showing an increase in processor capacity. Processors have increased the labour force, enabling them to operate at higher volumes. Access to labour has been supported by government programs such as the PALM scheme and the meat industry labour agreements, filling shortages not only in the processing sector but across the red meat industry. The Australian government has also announced an additional 2,300 places in regional placements, which will further assist filling labour shortages in the red meat industries that are concentrated in regional areas.
Thank you, Emily. It's good, provided a really good overview of the macroeconomic issues highlighted in the report. We'll now discuss some price forecasting that's been published in the September update. As MLA are unable to participate in price forecasting, the team has taken the opportunity to approach the top industry analysts for their independent forecasts. In the September update, an industry forecast was published extending through to the end of the year for two key MLA indicators. Erin, would you be able to elaborate on where the industry analysts expect prices to be by the end of the year?
Yep. So our projections report an aggregated analyst price estimate for two MLA indicators. These were in this round the brand new National Young Cattle Indicator and the Feeder Steer Indicator. So the industry analysts that were approached were Rabobank, Rural Bank, Mercado, Episode 3 and S&P Global, and they provided a price estimate for both of these indicators along with an upper estimation and a lower estimation, and these have been aggregated to these prices. So analysts forecast the National Young Cattle Indicator to reach 363 cents by the end of December, which is 8% above our current price, and that's with an upper estimate of 388 cents. The feeder steer indicator on the next slide is forecast to reach 378 cents, which is just 2% above current prices, and they have the upper estimation tipping 400 cents. Analysts have believed that prices will remain relatively stable with growing demand for Australian beef. This demand is going to support that price even as supply lifts.
Cheers for that, Erin. It's looking to be a pretty positive end of the year, I think. The Australian Bureau of Statistics provides a significant amount of information which is used by the industry. We have already spoken about ABS financial data, but moving on to more industry-specific information, could you please explain what was published in the recent quarterly update?
Yep. So MLA, red meat and most industries across Australia, even outside of agriculture, rely on the ABS for their reliable data collection. Last month, they released their second quarter figures, which gave us financial year totals of slaughter and production, and that was really helpful in us finalising and refining these projections and these forecasts. So slaughter and production were mostly in line with expectations, though there were some interesting results when looking through the female slaughter rate.
Thanks for that update. Would you mind explaining the female slaughter rate and how it impacts your forecast?
Of course. So industry have used the rate of female slaughter to total slaughter as a technical lead indicator to determine the growth phase that the herd is operating under. So when female slaughter composition falls below a 47% benchmark, the concept of a herd rebuild is supported and vice versa. So according to this recent data drop, in Q2, female slaughter lifted to 53%, which was the second quarter in a row above this benchmark, leading MLA to believe that the herd is in a technical destock. Female slaughter rates around this 50% normally have reflected drought turnoff. However, we know most of the country is not experiencing drought, and we have not been liquidating the younger female breeding stock. So we believe that this elevated female slaughter has been driven mainly by older breeding cows that have come to the end of their breeding tenure and been held off over that rebuild period. And then as well, positive prices for processor cows, which has been driven by that US demand, has created incentive to sell those cows, which has caused this rise in female slaughter. There are pockets of southern Australia which have been pushed to reduce their breeding herd due to dry conditions, and this constriction in the southern herd, along with producers refining their stocking capabilities, has tipped that reduction in the national herd.
So the ABS data clearly has an important role in the development of this document. Emily, with the recent updates to the ABS survey collection methods, it has been noted that it has caused a pretty significant change to the historical herd size. Could you please take us through what that change was and how the update was used in this September's projections?
No, absolutely. So ABS recently released a set of agricultural statistics using new methods and data sources, resulting in a revision of many figures, including the cattle herd size. Going forward, MLA will adopt the current ABS herd model as a base for our herd size, with the exception of one adjustment in FY22. In that year, ABS historical figures had a 0% change to the herd. MLA believes that the herd grew during this time. Slaughter had reached a 30-year low in 2022, live export reached a 17-year low, and the FSR was 42%, the lowest on record. These figures all point to a herd rebuild. As a result, MLA has adjusted the 2022 herd figure by 3% to reflect this insight. By lifting these figures, this has subsequently lifted the herd in the following years, increasing the base that MLA is forecasting from.
Okay. Considering what you've outlined regarding historical trends and movements, how large is the current herd and what is the forecast over the next couple of years?
The herd is estimated to have eased from 2023 to the current June 2024 estimate, landing at 30.2 million head. This slight reduction has been driven by the elevated turnoff of breeding cows, as previously mentioned. Cow retention over the rebuild period has led to a maturing herd, which is now flowing through to processors. Unstable conditions across southern Australia have caused elevated turnoff, also having an impact on the national herd. The herd will continue to ease in 2025 by another 2% to 29.5 million head and 3% reaching 28.6 million head in 2026. A reminder that this forecast is based on the assumption that climate conditions will remain average over the next 2 years.
With the herd expecting to ease, what impact will this have on our processing capabilities into the forecasted period? And can you provide some clarity on what we can expect regarding slaughter over this period as well?
So in 2024, cattle slaughter is forecast to rise 16% to 8.2 million head, the highest since 2019. In 2025, we will see another 33% rise in slaughter to 8.4 million head, before easing by 5% in 2026 to just below 8 million head. This lift in slaughter, along with our projected increase in live export, will cause the stock turnoff rate to lift over the forecasted period.
As you mentioned previously, slaughter is expected to rise, though not through drought-driven liquidation. Considering this, can you explain how carcass weights will react over the forecasted period?
So increased slaughter will still impact carcass weights. However, this has been less dramatic than we were experiencing during drought-based turnoff. Carcass weights have eased over the last year and are expected to continue to fall over the forecasted period. In 2024, carcass weights are expected to fall by 1.4% to 310 kilos. In 2025, carcass weights will continue to fall to 305 kilos before beginning to rise in 2026, back in line with the 5-year average. Increased female slaughter, combined with challenges from drought-like conditions in southeastern Australia, will lead to this reduction in the average national carcass weights.
Right. So moving on to production, what does the decline in carcass weight mean for production? And will the increase in slaughter offset the fall in carcass weights?
So we are expecting beef production by the end of 2024 to be the highest since 2015. Beef production is forecast to rise by 18% in 2024 to 2.53 million tonnes. In 2025, production is forecast to lift slightly to all-time record volumes and fall back 5% in 2026. Although slaughter is not forecast to reach the peaks in 2014 and 15, average carcass weights are now routinely 20 to 30 kilos above a decade ago, which indicates production volumes will reach these record highs without record slaughter levels.
All right. Thank you very much, Erin and Emily, for providing an overview of the domestic environment and the forecast out to 2026. Just a little reminder that the QR code is in the top right. If you have any questions, please submit them through. We'll now move on to the global environment and insights in introducing Tim, the global supply analyst in the market information team. Live export volumes rebounded from 10-year lows in 2023, with the number of factors, both domestic and international, affecting numbers. Tim, what are the forecasts for 2024's live export numbers?
Live export of cattle will rise by 20% this year to 810,000 head, before rising further to 860,000 head in 2025 and 890,000 in 2026. We do not expect that exports will rise above the million-plus head we saw in 2018 through 2020, but we do expect numbers to strengthen considerably as the northern herd stabilises and demand from Indonesia and Vietnam strengthens.
So looking at boxed beef exports, the increase in slaughter means we're looking at a considerable increase in the Australian beef production. Where do you think that additional beef will end up going?
Some of that additional beef will stay in Australia. We forecast that domestic consumption will rise to 645,000 tonnes this year and rise again to 650,000 tonnes in 2025. In general, domestic consumption has stayed relatively consistent over the last decade, and demand in Australia has remained strong. With that said, most of the surplus will be exported. We forecast that export volumes will reach 1.89 million tonnes in carcass weight terms this year, which is 26% above last year's volumes and will be a record volume of beef exported in a calendar year. We forecast that this record will be broken again in 2025, with exports rising slightly to 1.9 million tonnes before falling back slightly in 2026. As the beef supply in the United States has been shrinking for the past year and is forecast to continue shrinking, we expect demand in international markets to remain strong, and for this to boost Australian exports and to create an opportunity for exporters to build durable market share.
Okay. You mentioned the United States, a key competitor for Australian beef in the global market. Over the past few years, we've seen a substantial herd liquidation in the US. What does this mean for Australian prospects in the global market moving forward?
At the start of the year, the American cattle herd reached a 72-year low, and the herd has shrunk since then. The female slaughter rate has remained well above 47% for the first half of this year, and the number of heifers entering feedlots has remained well above the historic average. The continued destocking has meant that American exports have remained stronger than expected, but the fact that the herd is as small as it is means that slaughter cattle supply is now being restricted, and slaughter is falling, despite the current position of the US herd in the cattle cycle. This has two implications for Australian prospects on the market. Firstly, it means that exports to the United States will likely continue to rise. As the US is already Australia's largest market for beef in this year, that's great news. The second impact is that it removes US beef from the global market, which will impact the markets where Australia and the United States compete directly for market share, like Japan and South Korea. In these markets, total consumption tends to stay quite consistent over time, so the decline in US exports is likely to lead to an increase in Australian market share and a considerable opportunity for exporters.
So that all sounds like it's shaping up to be a pretty positive future. Looking at the other beef exporters, what does the global supply picture look like? And what does that mean for Australia?
So in South America, Brazil remains in a destock, but is expected to enter a rebuild in 2025. Exports are likely to remain strong, but may decline slightly in 25, dependent on the strength of the real. The picture is similar in Argentina. Most of the country has been in drought in 2024, and turnoff has been elevated, but improved conditions should lead to lower slaughter in 2025. In Argentina, there's the added caveat that the removal of exports restrictions in late 2023 temporarily caused a substantial lift in exports over the first half of 2024, which has now since normalized and means that exports will likely decline in the first half of next year. The key question for South America is the strength of the Chinese economy. If consumer confidence rises, then South American exports to China are likely to remain high. If not, then more South American beef is likely to end up being exported to the United States, the Middle East, and to be retained in domestic markets. Now looking at India, Indian production and export of Indian buffalo meat, or IBM, is forecast by the OECD to rise by 1% this year, as drought conditions in southern India boost turnoff and overseas demand lifts. We've also seen a shift in exports away from Southeast Asia and into the Middle East and North Africa region. This is in part due to demand from those markets and also reflects shifts in the grey trade in Southeast Asia. This all generally looks positive for Australia. The US is the most important competitor for Australian beef, but other countries substantially contribute to the overall supply picture. In that context, In 2025, it is likely that most major exporters have slightly lower export volumes than they currently do, boosting demand for Australian beef and creating an opportunity for exporters to build market share.
Perfect. Thank you, Aaron, Emily, and Tim, for the insights that you've shared. We'll move on to the questions that have been submitted, and please feel free to use the QR code that's on the screen at the moment to submit a few more if you have. Our first one that we are going to answer is, Aaron, are you able to talk about how will the sheep ban in WA have an impact on LiveX projections?
Sure thing. So Tim might be able to expand on this a bit, but live export forecasting is quite difficult because it's very hard to forecast the global political environment. So when we tip our heads into these numbers, we tend to assume that things are BAU. With the live sheep export phase, we have done export forecasts for the sheep industry projections, and we'll be doing a webinar on that tomorrow, but it's on our website. For this year, those forecasts have, the estimates for live sheep export this year is a little lower than trends, and then we have them going up in the next 2 years. For cattle, we have not changed much. We don't expect the cattle industry to be impacted by those sheep bans. So we've just gone business as usual.
Thanks, Aaron. Emily, would you be able to answer? We've got a question here. You mentioned that the forecasted production isn't expected to hit the highs seen in 2014, 2015, but 2025 was the same as 2014 on your graph. Could you please clarify?
Yeah, I think regarding that, we're just talking about how slaughter won't reach the levels that we saw in 2014 and 15. So we saw record levels of slaughter, but in this case, we're not going to see the same high levels of slaughter in 2014 and 15. But instead, that will be due to higher carcass weights. So as I mentioned previously, carcass weights are 20 to 30 kilos higher than they are a decade ago, and so that's what's really supporting that increase in production. And yeah.
Thank you for that. I'll pass to you again. We have a question here. Why do you accept the ABS numbers except for last year?
So the ABS, as we do for our modeling, we use a lot of their numbers, and but we don't accept it only because of that adjustment in FY22, and as a result of that, from that adjustment because of the growth in the herd, and as our projections are focused on percentage change and kind of the movements in the herd, opposed to the actual herd itself.
Okay, thank you for that. Tim, we have a question here. Do you expect live export to Southeast Asia to strengthen? And what growth year on year as they continue to develop and beef demand grows in the middle class expands?
So I don't have the year-on-year percentage figures in front of me right now, but in general, yes. In the projections, we do expect volumes to rise, and in particular, we see demand from Southeast Asian markets rising, and we mentioned Indonesia and Vietnam as kind of good examples of that. So in short, yes. This question though also raises something quite important, which is that the growth in like kind of incomes across Southeast Asia, and the tie that has to beef consumption presents a substantial opportunity for the Australian red meat industry across the whole, and that's both for live export of cattle, but also for boxed export of beef and sheep meat as well, really, because we're so well situated. And because we have already quite good trade links with a lot of these markets, as they continue to develop, as average incomes continue to rise, as household incomes continue to go up, that presents a really substantial opportunity for the Australian red meat industry as a whole.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. I'll pass to Erin here. We've got one. Does feedlotting impact the herd size?
Yeah, so feedlotting probably has less of an impact on the herd size, but definitely on production. We got Q2 figures from our Australian lot feeding brief and survey. So we work with Alpha to collect data on the feedlotting industry, and those Q2 figures showed that we were reaching records of numbers on feed, tipping 1.4 million, and then also record capacity. So the industry is growing strength to strength. When I say it impacts production more, feedlot is a very stable sector and a stable production sector, so it increases carcass weights, but then is relatively stable. So in periods of dry conditions, oversupply or undersupply, that feedlot sector will be relatively flat and provide that support to industry.
Thank you, Erin. Passing back to you, Erin, we've got a question. People focus a lot on the FSR alone, and if the herd is growing or contracting, what are the thoughts on actual female kill numbers, and what does this mean?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the FSR is used as an industry standard. We MLA use this same standard, so we have the 47% benchmark, where if it's above 47%, we like to think that the herd is contracting, and if it's below, we like to think it's expanding. It's also important to look at female kill numbers. But yeah, I think in terms of these projections, we've just really focused on that female slaughter rate percentage.
Perfect. Over to Tim now. Will supply chain issues overseas impact export volumes?
In these cattle projections, no. So just a first bit to understand that the model is put together on kind of a supply first basis. So we look at where the herd is, and then kind of build out from there. When in how we're looking at the model currently and how we're assessing the kind of global shipping, like the global freight market, we don't see and there's not a particular amount of supply chain disruption that's kind of built into any of the figures in the projections. Now, with that said, this is an unpredictable sort of world and things do happen. But at the present time, we don't particularly anticipate anything coming up. The other point to make is that there's been some media commentary around export flows around the Strait of Hormuz and difficulty getting ships up into the Red Sea on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. And about 85% of our exports in box terms in any given month are not going through there. Most of our exports are kind of Pacific based, so they're either going to North Asia, Southeast Asia, or North America, and then most of the remainder has been able to get through, whether it's going to the Middle East, North Africa region, or onto Europe. So while there has been some disruption, exports have still taken place, and we don't anticipate the supply chain disruptions would have a substantial impact on the volume of beef that we're able to export over the forecast period.
Okay, appreciate that, Tim. Emily, the NLRS slaughter report does not look like it's meeting your projected slaughter target. How far behind the official slaughter is the voluntary NLRS number?
So yeah, the NRLS slaughter report is actually a very useful tool, but typically on a national level, it's about 20% below the ABS figures that we see. On a state-by-state level, there are even further variations as it depends on which processors are reporting that week. And so it might look like the NRLS figures are nowhere near that, but if you add an additional 20%, it's very realistic, the slaughter numbers that we've projected over the forecasted period.
Thank you. Tim, quite a lot of interest in the overseas markets at the moment. We've got a question here. Any additional information on the China market demand?
Yeah, so just for history's sake, last year China was the largest market for Australian beef, for beef generally. in the world, and Brazilian exports of beef to China made up about 17% of total globally traded beef. So China is a very, very large market. The kind of China coming online has had a very significant impact on the structure of global beef markets generally. What we've seen this year, and we started to see maybe in the second half of last year, was that imports started slowing. That didn't mean at the time that they were necessarily going down, but the kind of growth of them started slowing. The last few months of this year, they've actually started easing somewhat. And so that is in part due to the kind of been ending of the shortage of protein after China had to slaughter a huge chunk of their hog herd, but it's also in part because there's relatively less strong consumer sentiment in China and consumer demand in China. It's somewhat difficult to ascertain where the market goes from here. What kind of can be certain is that it's likely to remain a very, very substantial market for protein generally and beef in particular over the coming years. But yeah, the key thing to watch will be how consumer sentiment goes and the flow-on impact that has on export volumes. In particular, as I said in the presentation, the main impact is on how much it leads to changes in Australian export volumes, but also South American export volumes. If exports from Brazil to China go down, then those exports are likely to either go into the United States, into the Middle East, or stay in Brazil, which would then have an impact on the total amount of beef available in the global market.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Tim. And we have another one here for you. Can you elaborate on how you see the threat of lumpy skin and FMD could affect the live export into Southeast Asia?
So that is quite that's a very broad question, and biosecurity is a little bit out of my kind of specific range of expertise. But in general, we understand that biosecurity in Australia is enormously important to our ability to trade freely with the world, which is why the industry as a whole makes such a substantial effort to ensure both that we retain our FMD and LSD and BSE free statuses, but also so that we have the traceability systems required to be able to prove that and to be able to effectively respond to any disease incursion as it comes up.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Aaron, has the planned shutdown in May 2028 of WA live sheep export by sea been considered in the projections for cattle live export from southern WA?
I can answer this one pretty quickly. So with the shutdown in 2028 and our projections forecast to 2026, like I mentioned before, we're going with a sort of business as usual approach for the next 3 years, and then we'll keep looking back to see how much that shutdown would impact those future forecasts when they come into that forecast period.
Okay, perfect. Tim, how are exports to the UK going after the FTA?
So exports beef exports to the UK are up quite substantially on pre-FTA volumes. They've well over doubled in the bit over a year now since the FTA has come into effect. Now, with that said, that was from a relatively low base, and so the exports to the UK still make up a small percentage of Australia's total export mix. But the type of product that we're exporting into the UK is quite differentiated, and the kind of marketing efforts from industry into the UK are largely built around exporting that kind of product. So as is, we are building up market share. It is kind of happening in a measured pace, but exports are up quite substantially, and over time. we would hope that there's a real opportunity there for us to build up that kind of durable market share in a high value market.
Okay. Aaron, are breeder cattle exports included in MLA's live export projections?
Yeah, so all live cattle exports are included. So by sea, by air, it just covers all, live exports.
Perfect. Tim, do you have an insight on the strength of the Australian consumer given competition from US buyers and higher living costs in Australia?
Wow, that's that's quite a difficult question, really. It's not necessarily an apples to apples sort of comparison, so it's different to say that directly. I can speak just kind of on the general historic trend, which has showed that domestic consumption has remained really very consistent over the past few decades. Export volumes tend to move around quite a bit and tend to actually kind of go over production. So if production goes up, exports will go up by more. But domestic consumption has stayed relatively steady. Australian consumers quite like beef, and demand has been consistent over that period, reflecting, I think, a relatively steady, strong sort of demand in the market for beef. But yeah, it's difficult to compare with American consumers directly because the market structures are slightly different.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Tim. Pass to Emily. If conditions move to an El Nino scenario in 2025 or 2026, could we see slaughter numbers going above 9 mil per year again?
So as I think everyone has realized over the last year, how difficult it is to predict the weather and the impact that it will have on slaughter. But as we've looked in our projections, we're projecting a slight average to dry conditions, and we're expecting slaughter to be around the 8.58 above 8 million head mark. And that's what we're projecting at the moment. And if conditions change, I think that those slaughter numbers will change with it.
Okay, thank you for that. Tim, another one for you. If Brazilian beef can access to all Asian countries, how will it impact on Australian beef industry?
Great. So this question, I would assume, is in reference to the news that the Brazilian government has announced that they have they're claiming essentially that they're FMD free without vaccination, and so they're now looking to the World Organization for Animal Health to certify that result. Now, this is important because previously Brazil had FMD free with vaccination status, which is a slightly different thing on a technical level, and importantly means that they were unable to export beef into Japan. And my understanding is that they don't have market access into South Korea either. So if they were to get access to, like, technical market access is what it's called, into Korea and Japan, what would the impact of that be? And what I can say is that it's likely that this process of certification, if they do get certified, will take several years. And then when they do get that technical market access, they will be substantially disadvantaged by Australia's preferential market access into both of those markets. So Australia has a number of high quality bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements, which allow most, I think well over 90% of Australia's beef exports to take place on better than most favoured nation rates, which is kind of the baseline for global trade. Brazil doesn't have an equivalent suite of trade agreements, which means that they would have to pay a very substantial tariff relative to what we would have to pay to export into those markets. So it's very difficult to put a kind of specific number on what would happen if Brazil got technical market access into the North Asian markets they currently don't export to. But what we can say is that if they do get that access, it will be a process that likely takes some time. And secondly, that when they do get that access, they'll then be at a substantial disadvantage in terms of Australia's preferential market access and high quality trade agreements.
Thank you, Tim. Well, there's been an overwhelming number of questions come through and an overwhelming number of people that have attended today. So thank you all for coming along. We want to say thanks to Aaron, Emily and Tim for your insights today. The responses have been shed some really good light on how 2024 has been and the future of the cattle industry. We will now answer, there's been a lot of questions and appreciate that. But that brings a close to MLA's Cattle Projections webinar. If you could please provide us your feedback as you leave using the QR code currently displayed. We'd much appreciate that. That would direct you through to a form and it just shapes the future of these events. Additionally, a recording will be made available shortly, which you can access via the MLA website or via YouTube. If you would like a PDF of the slide deck, we can provide that upon request. And finally, if your questions were not answered today, please reach out to the market information team. They'll be more than happy to help. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a great day.